for another episode of Nutrition Plus 101. Today we have Noah Jesko again and a special guest, Mark Robbins. Noah, I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you guys for listening again. Like Kristen said, we have Mark Robbins on today, and he is going to talk to us about our protein tubs. Mark works for Ridley, where we get a lot of our tubs made. And so he was kind enough to hop on. He's going to teach us how they're made, what's in them, all of those things. So, Mark, if you could please introduce yourself to the guys, and then we'll kind of get started.
Sure. Thanks, Noah and Kristen, for having me today. It's a pleasure to be here and really looking forward to having a conversation with you on our tubs or low moisture blocks, as we sometimes call them. So again, my name is Mark Robbins. I'm with Ridley Block Operations. I'm the Director of Research and Nutrition Services. I've been with Ridley Block, or RBO, we'll call it, quite often for 31 years. Started back in 95 here. Yeah, right at 31 years, because it was like January 17th, another cold day when I started then. But I've worked in the area of formulation, research, pricing, labeling. I did some QA work at one time for our company, and just kind of always kind of been what isn't a salesman and isn't a plant operations guy. It was kind of all lumped over to me. So, but I've got some help now. There's a couple, three of us in the tech service department, I guess we kind of call it, that we're available for any of your people. If you got questions, by all means, get a hold of us and we'll help you out.
Yes, sir. And I would like to point out to everyone that I have had multiple questions. You send Mark an email, he usually responds by the end of the day, and he has yet to not be able to answer a question that I've had.
You
So,
haven't helped me yet.
yes, sir. So, Mark, whenever you said that we were going to talk about our protein tubs, or as y'all
Yep.
call them, low moisture blocks, can you kind of explain that term, please?
Sure. Absolutely. That's a good place to start. So, at Ridley Block Operations, we actually manufacture four different types or forms of blocks. Most people would be familiar with what we're talking about here today, or a low moisture block. Some people call them lick tubs. A lot of people call them tubs. And, I kind of refer to all of them as blocks because we are Ridley Block Operations. That gets people kind of confused sometimes because they'll go, okay, are we talking about blocks or are we talking about tubs?
Yes, sir.
Well, when I say block, I'm including tubs in that. So we've got low moisture blocks that some people will call a cook tub. We have poured blocks poured blocks are a process that actually has what we would call an exothermic reaction. We take molasses and other protein meals and vitamins and minerals, mix them in with molasses and other liquids, and then we throw what we call a reactive agent in there, something like highly reactive magnesium oxide, for example. That reacts with the water and solidifies that block over the course of a few hours. With the low moisture blocks, of course, the hardness of that block is controlled by the fact that we take molasses and we actually boil the water out of it. Like if you were making taffy or something like peanut brittle, it's very similar to that process. While it's hot, it's pliable, it's moldable. We can blend in the vitamins and the protein meals. And then as it cools, it gets hard. So that controls the hardness of a low moisture block. An actual chemical reaction controls the hardness of the poured block. The low moisture block, it can only be consumed by licking it. It's hard enough that cattle can't get their teeth into it or anything. Poured blocks are softer. They do have a higher intake. A low moisture protein block is going to be around 3/4 of a pound intake. Poured blocks are going to be in that 1 to 2 pound intake, and sometimes it can go over 2 pounds. So then the third type of block we make is called a compressed block. This is actually just a large 200-pound tub that has had distiller's grains and other protein meals pressed into it. So those are 200-pound compressed tubs. And then the fourth block, most people will be very familiar with what we just call a pressed block. These are the 33-pound protein blocks or 40-pound mineral blocks that are, you see in a lot of different dealerships. They're very popular with wildlife. We have a Rumensin pressed block and a Rumensin bloat guard block that you have access to that you see in quite a few places. So that's the 4 forms: a pressed, a compressed, that's a 200-pound press, the poured block, and then the low moisture block.
So all of our pressed mineral blocks come from Ridley.
Yes.
And on these, the low moisture block is the protein tub that we would sell most often. We do and can sell the poured tubs, but most of what we will sell are these low moisture blocks. So in the cooking process, because sometimes we'll have sales reps that'll get an order and they'll say they're too soft, or you want them hard so that you can limit intake. In that cooking process, what changes that could lead to a low moisture block being softer than normal?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. The hardness of the low moisture block is critical to controlling the intake. And like I said, we have to remove basically all of the moisture from the molasses. And then when you add back, say a typical low moisture block is going to be somewhere around 800 pounds of dry base mix, and then about 1,200 pounds of cooked molasses. Now, if that 800 pounds is somewhere around 10 or 12% moisture in our protein meals like soybean meal, the dical, the limestone, some of our vitamins, that's basically where all the moisture comes from in the low moisture block. Low moisture blocks will run 2 to 5% moisture. So that moisture is actually coming back in from that base mix. We call those the dry ingredients, but they are actually the only thing that's contributing any moisture anymore in a low moisture block. So we strive to get the molasses down to almost 0% moisture. Now, sometimes there can be a little trouble with that. Our cooking process, we're always trying to totally dehydrate that block. But if you go too far, if you overcook those blocks, you can get what we would call a swell. And that is a chemical reaction. It's actually a Maillard reaction between a protein and a carbohydrate or a sugar that gives off a little molecule of carbon dioxide. You get enough of those little molecules of carbon dioxide, you get a bubble. You get enough of those little bubbles, you get a big bubble. And what it looks kind of like bread rising. It actually, and we just call that a swell. So we're trying to avoid that, but yet we need to get it cooked enough to get it hard enough for the intake to be low and controlled. So if you ever do have a little bit of trouble with intakes being high because of a soft product, that's the balancing act we're working with every day that maybe didn't get exactly right on a particular batch. Now, our batch process allows us to get that correct much more often than our competitive processes out there that we call continuous flow. They don't cook by batches. We actually have steam jacketed cookers that hold a couple tons of molasses, and we can cook that to an end point based on where we want that to be to get that moisture down low enough to make a hard block. And that can vary, each batch can vary. And our molasses, molasses is a byproduct of the sugar industry. So that in itself says it's going to be inherently variable. That sugar industry is in business to sell sugar. Yeah, they got a lot of molasses, but that's not their primary product. Kind of like the ethanol industry. They're in business to sell ethanol, and distillers' grains are their byproduct. And we all know the variation you can see in times with distillers' grains. We have the same situation with molasses. The moisture is going to vary up and down some, and our batch process is actually better suited to take that varying moisture levels of different truckloads of molasses and still produce a consistent, hard, low moisture block.
There is a lot to the cooking process that most people don't see. Whenever I toured y'all's plant, it was pretty eye-opening to me, how much variation and how much goes into just cooking these tubs.
Very much so. So the other thing is, so you may question, okay, why doesn't everybody just go with this batch process then? Well, as you alluded to there, Noah, there's a lot involved with this. The batch process that we use, and we are really about the only company left using that batch process. Almost all our competitors will use a continuous flow. And they use that process because of two things. It's cheaper to build a continuous flow process for a low moisture block plant, and it's cheaper to run it. It doesn't take as much steam power to run it, and there's much less equipment to build it. All of our equipment has to be stainless steel, and we take a fair bit more steam pressure and power to actually dry out these batches of molasses versus the continuous flow. So you can see the attractiveness that the continuous flow had 10, 20, 30 years ago when we started seeing a lot more competitors and people wanted to get into the game. That offered them a little lower bar as financially to get into the game and start making blocks. The cost or the trade-off of that was a little more variability in the quality of their blocks and how hard they are and how well they control the intake then.
Yes, sir. So whenever we're looking at a tag for one of these low moisture blocks, one of the tubs that we focused on in some of our other conversations for our reps was our 30% ultra tub.
Mm-hmm.
And the first thing you always talk about whenever you're talking about low moisture blocks is protein. Whenever you look at these tags and it says 30% protein, where is that protein coming from?
It's a good question. So generally anything over a 25% protein in a low moisture block is going to be what we would call a mix of natural proteins and NPN or non-protein nitrogen. And now you can at times with beet molasses get up to a 30% all natural. We could probably do that with cane molasses, but it gets to be a little bit of a stunt to do that. Like I said, most people would kind of stop at a 25% for an all natural. And when we say all natural, that means it does not have the NPN or non-protein nitrogen in it. So if you have a 30% tub that says it'll say 30% crude protein in the top line, and then right underneath that, if it has NPN in it, it's going to have to state that next, and it will say does not contain more than, say, 15% or 18% NPN. So what is this NPN? Well, ruminant animals by design have a very attractive feature to them in that the microbes in the rumen can utilize protein to make and grow more bacteria or microbes that digest the feed, or they can use just any source of nitrogen. And urea, for example, that's what most people use for their non-protein nitrogen. Urea is 46% nitrogen. And so that's a very concentrated, much cheaper source of nitrogen than, say, true protein from cottonseed meal that's 41% protein, or soybean meal that's 48% protein. Corn gluten meal would be the highest protein level in a plant protein we can find, and that's about 61%. But it's also very expensive because it's used by the pet food industry. Now, we will also use, sometimes you'll have a product that has hydrolyzed feather meal in it. That's an animal protein. It's made from feathers that have been chemically treated and hydrolyzed to make the protein more available. Feather meal actually comes in around 80 to 83% protein. So most all of these 25% all natural protein blocks that you will see will have some animal protein or feather meal in them. But now getting back to the NPN, like I said, the microbes in the rumen can use that urea to pull the nitrogen off of there and build more microbial protein. They can multiply themselves just using that nitrogen from the urea. Now, there are some amino acids or proteins that are essential that they can't build, that you have to have some natural protein coming in there. But low moisture blocks are especially efficient at using some level of non-protein nitrogen as the actual protein complement of the block. We'll say fit 30% protein, but 15% NPN. So that's half of that block is natural protein, but the other half that's NPN is actually coming from urea or something like that. Urea is the most common source of NPN. You will see some blocks out there that may have some biuret in it, which is a couple of urea molecules hooked together. Things like ammonium chloride, that will contribute a little bit of NPN. Urea is basically what you're using because it's a good available source and it's cheaper than some of the other non-protein nitrogen sources. So that's what that NPN means. Like I said, those blocks, we've done a lot of research, digestion trials with universities using blocks that have that non-protein nitrogen in them. It works very well. The only thing you have to have in the rumen with the non-protein nitrogen to make sure that it works good is some energy. And of course, when you think of a low moisture block, having that dehydrated molasses to it, every time a cow licks that block and she gets a lick, she gets trace minerals, she gets vitamins, she's going to get some of those sugars from that molasses, and she'll get a little bit of that non-protein nitrogen. That works out very efficiently in the rumen where you have the energy and the non-protein nitrogen both going in with every lick.
So on the crude protein, what is the maximum amount of crude protein that you can feasibly put into a block?
For a low moisture block, 40% is about it. We have experimented with some 50s and some 60s, and in that you can make those products. The only problem is, you're getting up to a point where you don't want to get to a point where the urea can become toxic.
Yes,
And
sir.
at a typical intake, you're very far from that, but you got to have some level of a safety net in there. And so you want to be able to say, look, even if they ate 3, 4, 5 pounds of this block by some strange accident or occurrence, it's still safe. That's a little harder to do with something that's 50 or 60% protein and maybe, 40 or 50 of that protein comes from urea. The 40s are a good place to stop. Usually you can get by with like about half of that 40% or somewhere around 20 being NPN. And that's still a very safe block, even if cattle consume 3 or 4 pounds of that.
Okay. So next on the tag, right after you look at the crude protein, you're going to see the crude fat. So this 30% that we have is 10%. Can you talk to us about where the fat comes?
Sure. So for our cooking process, if you remember, I talked about our batch cooking. It actually, you look in those cookers, the molasses is actually bubbling in there. So we need to use some sort of a surfactant so that it doesn't create a foam. And so we use hydrolyzed vegetable oil as our fat source. And that's what you see on that label then if the fat is 3, 4, or 5%, or if it goes up to 10%. That's coming from hydrolyzed vegetable oil. Like I said, we have to have a minimum amount of that in every low moisture block to make it cook properly. But then we do try to increase the energy content of the block with that fat. Now, like I said, it's a hydrolyzed vegetable oil, and we do get some calls for some higher levels of fat in the blocks, trying to raise the energy level of the block. That's possible. That does work. But actually, most of the energy that your cattle are going to get when you feed a low moisture block is going to come from the increase in the forage digestibility that the protein in that block brings. So you really want to make sure you're taking care of protein first. And then if you want to add some higher levels of fat, that's fine. But most of that energy or the increase in body condition that we see with cows when they go on low quality forage and you put a low moisture block that's say 30% or 32% protein with that, most of that extra energy is being unlocked by the protein that's in the block that's feeding the bugs in the rumen, and they are proliferating and then they digest more of the forage. The fat itself in the low moisture block is a smaller portion of the extra energy you get into that cow.
So a question on the crude fat, same question I asked on the crude protein. How high can you go? And are there any effects on consumption as you increase to a certain point?
Yeah, good question. So we really don't want to go over a 10 or a 12% fat guarantee, because that gets to the point where we're using enough vegetable oil. You can start to have blocks that are a little softer, especially when it's really hot out or it's hot and they're in the sunshine. And then, of course, that's going to lead to a higher consumption. So we're pretty comfortable in that 10 to 12 range. I've seen or heard of some blocks that are up to 15% fat. And that's going to be a bit of a stunt. I wouldn't be comfortable with that unless you were using something like, say, flaxseed to contribute some of that, some sort of a dry ingredient, or maybe a megalac type product, or a bypass fat type dry product that's going to contribute some fat to that formula. And thereby you can have a lower amount of vegetable oil in there, but still have a higher level of fat. The problem with that is those dry forms of fat are quite a bit more expensive than our liquid vegetable oil. So there's a trade-off there, that if you want to go to some higher level of fat and we use a dry fat to do that, the cost of the block is going to increase a little more exaggeratedly than you would expect.
So the next and probably final question or topic I want you to touch on is, now all of our blocks have macro and micronutrients, and then they also have vitamins in it. Can you talk a little bit about those in the tub, but then maybe touch on, based on consumption, whether or not those guarantees are enough for a cow, or whether or not you should have a loose mineral or a pressed mineral block, etc., out there with it?
Yep, very good question. So the first thing I'll say before we get into the requirements, one thing I'd like to point out for everyone, it's really good to know on vitamins in low moisture blocks. Some people might say, well, those are cooked and that heat could degrade the vitamins, but we only cook the molasses and the vegetable oil. You're not cooking your vitamins or your trace minerals or your additives, like say biomass or any of those protein meals. They don't get cooked. Now they will get mixed in at a temperature somewhere around 180, 170 degrees Fahrenheit, but they'll cool down from that. And of course, we have assayed our vitamin levels over the years to make sure that they're all there. And the nice thing that we find, not only are they there right after you're done manufacturing, so the heat of that process has not degraded them at all. We have found low moisture blocks up to 3 years old that still have the formulated level of vitamins A and E in them. So it's a really good medium to save nutrients. When you think about things that degrade vitamins, it's moisture, it's sunlight, it's air. You don't have any of that inside that low moisture block. It's very low moisture. There's no sunlight in there, and there's really no air in there. So it makes good sense that you can assay these blocks 2-3 years down the road and find all the vitamins. Now, back to your question about requirements and what you have in there for macro minerals, trace minerals, and vitamins. It's very easy to provide 100% or even 200% of what a cow will need every day as far as trace minerals and vitamins. Those are relatively small doses that you need every day, and we can easily cover those in a low moisture block. Even if they only eat 3/4 of a pound on a protein block, you can even do it on mineral blocks that they eat closer to 4 ounces on. So what we need to watch then are those macro minerals, things like calcium, phosphorus, magnesium. Potassium generally isn't an issue. But magnesium, in times, if you have customers that have trouble with grass tetany, we can formulate high mag blocks, and those work extremely well because magnesium oxide that we use as our source of magnesium is very unpalatable. And it's a little harder sometimes to get cattle to eat a high mag mineral. You make a high mag, low moisture block, and that molasses covers up that taste very well. It's quite attractive. It's really a good way to get good intake on grass tetany situation, because a lot of times that grass is pretty green and lush, and that's the time of the year when intake of self-fed supplements can be a challenge, just because the grass is green. It's a lot easier to get those cows to eat some of that low moisture block because it has a lot of molasses in it. So the other thing, calcium and phosphorus, in a lot of situations, calcium is going to be usually there'll be enough calcium in your forages. Most of your forages are going to be short on phosphorus. If you look at grains, they have plenty of phosphorus, but many times the grain diet needs some calcium added to it. But where our cows are out grazing, a lot of these forages or low quality forages, calcium is going to be okay, but we need to make sure they're getting enough phosphorus. That one you can handle in low moisture blocks to some degree. And there are times that you should be providing a mineral with that low moisture block in order to make sure that cow has enough phosphorus. So the rule of thumb I use is if you're feeding a protein low moisture block and it's got 1% phosphorus in it, on most forages, that's enough phosphorus to get you through the first trimester. If you feed a low moisture block that's got 2% phosphorus in it, that's going to get you through the first and the second trimester for phosphorus. And then after that, you should put a free choice mineral with that low moisture block to provide more phosphorus. You don't really need that free choice mineral to be overly fortified with vitamins and trace minerals, because we generally got that taken care of in the low moisture block, but you do need some extra phosphorus in that cow for that third trimester. And then certainly once she calves and goes into lactation, depending on what kind of forage they're on at that point, hopefully you're back onto some green grass about that time and you're starting to get a nice bump from the forage. But yeah, 1% phos will get you through the first trimester. 2% phos generally gets you through the second trimester. And after that, you need a mineral with that block.
So Mark, is there a reason that you stop at 2% phos instead of just going up to 3 or 4% phos and not having to put out a loose mineral?
Yeah, very good question. So it is possible to go up to, say, about a 4% phos and still have room in that low moisture block for some protein. A lot of that protein is going to be that non-protein nitrogen or from urea. But what you end up with is kind of a deal where you keep cranking up that phosphorus level, that cranks down your intake level too. So now it's kind of like, yeah, I'm getting more phosphorus in the block, but now they're eating less of it. Am I really getting more phosphorus into that cow or not? For the industry, we generally kind of stop with most products at a 2% phos, because you'll still get really close to that 3/4 pound intake on a protein block, but now you've got twice as much phos as some of the other products that are only 1% phos.
I like that you pointed out the magnesium, those high mag blocks, because that is something that whenever we go out and take grass samples, which we've discussed with some of our on these podcasts,
Yep.
that if they need a bunch of mag, that you can only add it in a loose mineral to a certain point before you're right. It'll keep them from eating it. And so the idea that we could increase mag significantly and then put it in a block like this and still have cattle consume is a good point. I'm glad you made that.
It is. It works really well. If most of those high mag, low moisture blocks are either going to be 4 or 4.4% magnesium. You kind of splitting hairs there, whether it's 4 or 4.4. But if you're in that range and they eat a half pound of it, that's about 10 grams of magnesium. And that's going to be about half of what they need. So you're not providing 100%, but you're getting half. They should still get some magnesium out of the forage, even in a hot pasture for grass tetany. The problem is they won't get enough. And that 10 grams that you're getting out of that high mag, low moisture block is usually enough to carry those cows. I would say good practice for that is to put those mag blocks out ahead of the threat of grass tetany. Not because a cow can store magnesium oxide. They can't. They can only what's floating around in their rumen can they store, and that's not enough. But the idea is make sure all those cows in that herd have found that high mag block and are licking on it or consuming it before the grass tetany event happens. Just it makes sense to get that a little bit ahead of time, so they all find it. They're all consuming it. So when the day comes that that magnesium becomes unavailable in that forage, they're already on the blocks and going with it.
Yes, sir. Well, Mark, that's about our time, and I appreciate it for everything, hopping on, talking to us. We got about 5 minutes left. If you could give us 1 or 2 points for our sales reps to take out to these ranches whenever they're trying to sell these low moisture blocks, what would those be?
Sure. So I think the biggest point when we're talking about self-fed supplements is that we realize they're self-fed supplements. And sometimes you'll have customers that say, the protein level in here seems like I'm paying a lot for protein compared to, say, something like cottonseed meal or something that's in cake or a pelleted form or a cube form. But we have to remember that they are self-fed. And so by that nature, your labor input is much reduced. And so now there should be some value for that. If you do buy hand-fed supplements, you know the cost of that supplement. You buy a block, you know the cost of that supplement. Comparing the cost of those two is not really apples to apples, because the block will feed itself, the hand-fed supplement will not. So customers need to figure out, a little bit, what does it cost me to deliver that hand-fed supplement? I guess the other thing I would say, the nice thing about our blocks is that they do contain a lot of molasses. And as we've talked over with the magnesium, cattle love molasses. They like to go lick on it. And so you get a couple of benefits there. Number one, it's hard for a boss cow to keep someone else away from the barrels or the tubs when you have 4, 5, 6, 8 of them out. They can't be a boss of everyone. So your timid cows are more likely, maybe it's at midnight, maybe it's 3 in the morning, they hit these tubs all hours of the day. We know that from some GPS collar work we did years ago. You get the smaller, more timid cows, they get their share. And like I said, the other thing is, with the molasses matrix of these, that's very attractive, very palatable. We have data with cows that have been collared where we measured how often they come to the blocks, how long they stay there, what percentage of your herd comes to the blocks. We've also looked at what percentage of the herd go to other supplements. And we found that the highest percentage of cows that will come to a supplement is with the low moisture block, or say a liquid supplement, which, liquid supplements are molasses as well. Yeah, it's not really rocket science there. It's kind of rocket science tracking them with GPS.
Yes,
but
sir.
They like molasses in the sugar. That just makes good sense. So keep in mind that you will get more of your herd on the mineral or on the additive, be that fly control, be that something like biomass, or just the vitamins that give us an improved reproductive performance. You'll get more of your herd to actually consume that mineral and that protein if it's in the low moisture block versus some of the other supplements that are available, just because it's available 24/7. It's available in multiple sites, and molasses tastes good and they like it.
Yes, sir. Well, Mark, thank you very much from Nutrition Plus and the rest of our team for hopping on and talking to us. I'd like to remind all of our sales reps that you can call me or shoot me an email if you have any questions, and I can pass that on to Mark. So thank you, and I hope that we get to do this again sometime.
I had a great time, Noah. I'd look forward to doing another one.
Yes, sir.